Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad that you decided to join us again for another episode of The Quest for the Cures Continues. If you tuned in last night, and I hope you did, you learned a lot about diagnostics for cancer, which ones are good and which ones aren't so good, and you began to learn about natural treatments for cancer. If you enjoyed that, then you're really going to enjoy tonight's episode because it's totally dedicated to natural treatments for cancer. The first interview is with Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. He's a medical doctor. He's got an office in New York City. And he specializes in pancreatic enzymes and detoxification, as well as a structured diet to treat cancer. He's had tremendous success with many types of cancer that are considered to be untreatable with conventional oncology. For instance, pancreatic cancer. If you are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it's the equivalent of a death sentence if you go with conventional treatments. They don't even claim to have a treatment for pancreatic cancer. Almost no one lives past 5 years. Well, Dr. Gonzalez shared with me a story of one of his patients that's 32 years out from diagnosis. She was diagnosed 32 years ago with pancreatic cancer, and she's still alive. She was given the gift of life because of Dr. Gonzalez's treatment. I only wish that maybe I had known about this treatment back when my father was diagnosed in 1996, because I would have loved to have had him with me these last 18 years. Fortunately for this lady, she has been with her family for the last 32 years, and they've been able to enjoy her. It's just so amazing to me, these natural treatments for cancer, they really work, and people are alive because of them. It's an encouraging story, and this is going to be an encouraging episode because you're going to see that there is hope and that cancer doesn't have to be a death sentence. So hope you enjoy the show. Dr. Gonzalez, talk about the protocol that you are using. If you could go back and kind of give a few details about what protocol Dr. Kelly was using, and then how you've adopted that into your practice now. What are you using?
Kelly's program and our program have three basic components. And our therapy today, 25, 27 years later, is really a derivation of Kelly. We follow his model pretty closely. It involves three basic components: individualized diet, individualized supplement programs with, for cancer patients, large doses of pancreatic enzymes, and detoxification routines like the coffee enemas. Now, unlike a lot of alternative practitioners who use one diet for everybody, like Atkins thought everyone should be on a meat diet, the Gerson people think everyone should be vegetarian, Kelly realized early on different people need different diets, and some people do well with a plant-based diet, other patients need fatty red meat 2 or 3 times a day. He had 10 basic diets and 94 variations. An investigative journalist that I was at heart when I first met him, I challenged him, and he showed me on his computer the 10 basic diets and 94 variations. And even then, he would individualize the diet. So he didn't have, and we don't have one diet. We follow that tradition. We have 10 diets and dozens of variations. Secondly, large doses of nutritional supplements. Vitamins, minerals, trace elements, glandular extracts from animals like liver, thymus, lung, pancreas, heart. These glandular products are made for us in New Zealand. Now, we don't believe the vitamins, minerals, trace elements, and glandular products are going to cure or reverse cancer. What they do provide is nutritional support. You know, we're doing two things. We're trying to attack the cancer directly, but we're also trying to rebuild a ravaged body. A lot of the patients that came to Kelly, a lot of the patients we see, not only have advanced cancer, which just wrecks the body, but also have been treated with aggressive chemo, radiation, all kinds of combinations that also ravage the body. So we're trying to rebuild the body and also attack the cancer, and you can attack the cancer better if you rebuild the body. So the vitamins, minerals, trace elements, glandular products help restore the normal equilibrium and homeostasis of the body. And even then, these supplement programs are very individualized. Kelly did, and we do, individualize all these supplement programs. So no two patients are on exactly the same protocol. Some of them, of course, are similar. Now, in addition to the vitamins, minerals, trace elements, etc., designed specifically for each patient, we use, for cancer patients, large doses of pancreatic enzymes. Now, this was Kelly's great innovation and the tradition we follow, of course. Now, pancreatic enzymes have been known since the 1850s and 1860s, and they're known as digestive enzymes. They help us break down proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. In addition, Dr. John Beard was the great professor at the University of Edinburgh, English by birth, Scottish by profession. He taught at Edinburgh all his professional life. He was a very brilliant embryologist, got his doctorate in 1884 from the University of Freiburg in Germany. And he was one of the great embryologists. His work in embryology is still quoted today in the literature. But his work in embryology led him on a side tangent into pancreatic enzymes and cancer. He was not trained as a cancer researcher, but he was a brilliant man, like a lot of brilliant men, like Linus Pauling, that become experts in a lot of different fields. And in 1902, he wrote the first paper claiming pancreatic enzymes, in addition to their digestive capability, which had been well documented by that point, They're the body's main defense against cancer and would be useful as a cancer treatment. And brilliant man that he was, he did animal studies. We think of 110 years ago as a primitive time in science where scientists worked out of caves with candles. Well, actually, it was very sophisticated. By 1902, pathologists, and Sloan Kettering already existed by that point, brilliant pathologists in the US and Europe had already evaluated and diagnosed and defined the 100 different types of cancer. They knew what cancer was, they knew what it looked like, they knew how it behaved, they knew how to examine it in a biopsy under the microscope. So Beard took an animal model, which they had at that time for cancer, and used his enzymes as the first study of enzymes in history, and got 100% regression of cancer in the animals that he treated, whereas the control group died very quickly. Then physicians, he was not a physician, he was an SCD, had a doctorate degree, so he wasn't able to treat patients directly, but physicians working under him began using enzymes. The first case was 1905, a case of head and neck cancer, and the person who administered it, Dr. Clarence Rice, had an office about 5 blocks from this office where we're sitting now, right on Madison Avenue, so it's kind of a historic place to be in terms of enzymes. And the tumor completely regressed, and it was published in the conventional medical literature. I've collected dozens of articles in the peer-reviewed conventional literature from the period 1905 to 1911 where physicians under Beard's guidance treated advanced cancer, colon cancer, rectal cancer, breast cancer, endometrial cancer, lung cancer, successfully with the enzymes. He wrote a book in 1911, The Enzyme Treatment of Cancer. We actually had photographs of patients, sequential photographs of patients with head and neck cancer where the tumors actually disappear and the skin heals normally. 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. But the work then, as it is today, was considered too controversial. But there was another footnote, which I often talk about in my lectures. At the same time Beard was showing the enzymes reverse cancer, Madame Curie, the great French, well, she was Polish by birth, but she was working at the University of Paris, she was investigating radiation, and radiation, X-rays had been discovered in 1895. By 1900, they were used diagnostically. You know, the miraculous. You do an X-ray, you can see the inside of the chest and see the lungs. By 1905, Madame Curie was saying that radiation would be a simple, easy, non-toxic way of treating all cancer. And she had 2 Nobel Prizes already. One of the few people, Linus Pauling also had 2. Few people had ever won 1, let alone 2. And she was well loved by the media. She was the first great media star. She knew how to use the media. She knew how to hold press conferences. And she announced radiation as the cure to cancer to the media. Beard was this nerdy ivory tower scientist who thought the media was a bunch of morons, had no use for them, no use for his critics. He wasn't maybe the most diplomatic person who ever lived. Madame Curie knew how to nurture the media. So all over the world, Madame Curie, the great beloved, you know, she was the first woman to get a PhD in theoretical physics at the University of Paris. So she had this extraordinary history. Movies have been made about it. And the press loved her. Who cared about Dr. Beard and pancreatic enzymes? Well, nobody, apparently. So it was book 1, unheeded. Radiation came into the forefront of cancer treatment. Of course, Madame Curie was completely wrong on all counts. It isn't non-toxic. In fact, she herself died as a result of radiation exposure. She died of aplastic anemia caused by radiation. Most tumors that regress come back very quickly, more deadly, and it was, you know, only a few cancers actually responded to it. So radiation was not the simple, easy, non-toxic way of treating all cancer. She was wrong. But by that point, by the time scientists realized that, you know, hundreds of them died. That 100 scientists involved with radiation died because of their cavalier exposure to radiation, thinking, you know, it's invisible, so it's safe. To answer your original question, the 3 components: individualized diet, individualized supplements, large doses of pancreatic enzymes. Third component is detoxification, which is often the component of the therapy that elicits the most grins and mockery from conventional doctors. But it's really very simple. You know, when Kelly was treating himself, he was taking the pancreatic enzymes and tumors were breaking down, and that's when he got really sick, almost life-threateningly sick. First he thought the enzymes aren't working anymore, but then he realized the tumors are shrinking, I'm getting sick, and then he realized I'm reacting to the tumor waste. And indeed, conventional oncologists know today, in 2014, that nothing is more toxic to the human body than dead cancer. In fact, chemotherapy, though it doesn't work for most cancers, does work for some, like Hodgkin's and certain leukemias. And in a Hodgkin's patient, if you break a tumor down too fast with chemo, you'll kill the patient from the dead tumor. And they call it tumor lysis syndrome. It's recognized in the textbooks. All my textbooks, conventional textbooks, talk about it. Well, Kelly recognized that back in 1963 when he was trying to get over his own cancer. And he started going into the literature, as he always did. He was a great scholar. He would go into the literature trying to find some technique that would help his liver and kidney work better. The liver and the kidney are the body's main detoxification organs. That's for environmental chemicals, our own metabolic waste. A dead cancer are processed and neutralized and prepared for excretion. And he opens up the Merck manual, and lo and behold, they're coffee enemas. You know, The interesting thing, or the sad thing, is the ironic thing, Kelly was brutalized in the media for his use of coffee enemas. We get attacked about it today too. But they come right out of the conventional medical literature. He didn't learn about it from alien space beings being projected into his brain through some mystic psychic experience. He didn't learn about it through some alternative throwaway journal, his local health food store. He learned about it from the conventional medical textbooks. The Merck Manual is a compendium of conventional therapies, and they were in the Merck Manual. Coffee enemas were in the Merck Manual right up until the 1970s. And when I was doing my investigation of Kelly, trained investigator reporter that I was, I called up the editor of the Merck Manual then and had a talk with him. And he said the only reason they were taken out is we get kind of folksy and we had all this high-tech stuff to use. And he had files on coffee enemas, which he sent me. And dozens of studies from the 20s and 1930s and 40s at major institutions where they're using coffee enemas for a variety of things, arthritis, mental illness. I have a study from the New England Journal of Medicine, the preeminent medical journal in the U.S., 1932, from Harvard Medical School, a group of research psychiatrists successfully treated what we today call bipolar illness, in those days they called it manic depressive, with enemas. And their hypothesis was that there were toxins from the intestinal tract that were polluting the mind, and that's what was causing the mental illness. And they put these people on enemas and colonics, and they got well, they got them off medication and out of the hospital. It was in the New England Journal. I have a copy, 1932. I have a study from Uruguay. Just because it's Uruguay doesn't mean they weren't serious scientists. You know, people downplay it was not from Boston. It was a good study. They had patients with septic shock. In those days, septic shock occurs because gram-negative bacteria produce a polysaccharide, a kind of a carbohydrate that's toxic to the human, and people die from that. The death rate today is still in the range of 40 to 50% with septic shock. In those days, it was like 90%. Well, these people in Uruguay at an intensive care, what we would call an intensive care unit today, had learned about coffee enemas from the conventional medical world, started treating their patients with coffee enemas, and had great success and published it in a peer-reviewed journal. We have a translation. It was originally published in Spanish. Almost like 90% reversal of septic shock. That should have changed the way hospitalists treat septic shock all over the world. It was ignored because it was folksy, it wasn't high-tech, even then, in 1941, 42. So we have dozens of articles. Kelly collected them, dozens of articles from the mainstream peer-reviewed medical literature discussing the use of enemas, coffee enemas, other types of colonics in the successful treatment of all kinds of illnesses. So he incorporated them into his practice, and it helped, and he added other things like liver flushes and colon cleanses and juice fasts and skin brushing, which is an old naturopathic technique to get the lymphatics to work better, kidney flushes, all kinds of techniques that we still use today. I went through over 10,000 of Kelly's records, interviewed over 1,000 of his patients, evaluated 455 of his advanced cancer patients who had done well, evaluated 50 at great length representing 26 different types of cancer. Some of these patients we actually saw in our own immunology clinic with Dr. Good. It's really amazing. I wish I had film of this. Dr. Good examining these Kelly patients and writing notes in the official hospital records with his white coat and a stethoscope. We put it together in monograph form. I did the writing, I did the research. He was my mentor. So I evaluated 50 patients with 26 different types of cancer, all poor prognosis or terminal or advanced, who enjoyed extraordinary responses that could only be attributed to Dr. Kelly's nutritional program. Put this together in monograph form, 1986, finished my immunology fellowship. Now here I have Dr. Good as my mentor, the most published author in the history of medicine, 50 books to his credit. He was either editor or co-writer of 50 books, over 2,000 papers, couldn't get it published. The general response were one of two. First, a lot of the editors didn't believe it. In fact, I have some letters in my office from editors who warned Dr. Good this had to be a scam, fraudulent, and I've conned him or something like that, even though we saw the patients in our own clinic and Dr. Good knew they were real. The other thing is, editors would say, this is real, but if it's real, it's the most extraordinary thing in medicine, but it's also the most controversial in nutritional approach to cancer. This is 1986, where to mention nutrition and cancer in the same sentence was tantamount to a felony. And the editor said, this would be the end of my publishing career. The American Cancer Society, the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute will make sure that I can't feed my children. So they would pass. I tried for 2 years, couldn't get it published, eventually put it away, but finally in 2010 we published it, updated, rewritten with a long introduction by me, updating it to 2010. Now, at that point, Dr. Good was not at Sloan Kettering. I finished my immunology fellowship. We had a long talk, went out to dinner, and he said something very interesting. I don't have it on tape, so I can't confirm it. But he said, you know, some of these cases are so extraordinary, like a 5-year survivor of pancreatic cancer, which he'd never seen. And his own second wife, one of his former wives, married 3 times, had died of pancreatic cancer within 2 months. And he was president of Sloan Kettering. He couldn't save his own wife. She died quickly. He said, "You're showing me these cases." He said, I don't know how Kelly's doing this. I've never seen anything like this, and I'm president of Sloan Kettering. I mean, he said, people come from all over the world for my advice about cancer. You know, the whole Iranian crisis began because of Dr. Good. The Shah of Iran got sick, so he wanted the best physician in the world to come evaluate him, so he picked Robert Good, flew Robert Good in his private jet, the Shah's private jet, to Iran. Dr. Good examined him, and he was a brilliant clinician as well as researcher. Within 10 minutes made the diagnosis. He says, "You got gallbladder cancer." He said, "You got to come to New York." So he came to New York and New York Hospital, and that's when the Iranian Revolution began. So it actually,
I had no idea.
No one knows this at all. No one knows that the Iranian Revolution began because of Robert Good, president of Sloan Kettering, my mentor. Kelly himself had cancer when he was trying to fight his own battle, and he was an orthodontist by training.
What type of cancer did he have?
He had pancreatic cancer. Now, I spoke to his doctors, who when I first did my research 30 years ago, they were still alive. They never biopsied. They said he was too unstable. They didn't want to bring him to surgery. And this is before CAT scans. It was in the early 1960s. But they did x-rays. He had tumors in both lungs, fluid in his lungs, tumor in his hip. In fact, he always walked with a limp because the tumor had eaten through his hip bone. He had a tumor in his heart, which is rare for pancreatic cancer. It was in his bone. And they said there was nothing we could do. They gave him 2 months to live, and he had 4 young kids, all of them adopted. He had mumps as a teenager, so mumps could make you sterile. So he couldn't have kids, so he adopted 4 kids out of the orphanages. And he was afraid if he died, they'd end up back in the orphanage. So he said, "I can't die." He just made that. Kelly was a very determined guy. He also had an IQ twice of most of us. He said, "I'm not going to die." So he went through the literature, started to realize the only thing he could do is change his diet. Then he learned about Beard's work from, at that point, it was like 60 years earlier, added on enzymes and got well. And then the local doctors, you know, Kelly was very well known in a town where he lived. He lived in Grapevine, Texas, which is a suburb, as you know, Texas, you're a Texas boy, suburb of Dallas-Fort Worth. In those days, it was a pokey professional suburb. Now it's, you know, like Dallas is like taking over the world. But it was a pokey town, you know, Grapevine. And he was in the country club and taught Bible study on Sundays, and he was in the church and the school board. Everyone knew him. He was in the country club. And the doctors saw him rise from the dead like Lazarus. So they started quietly, this is 1964, 65, sending their cancer patients to Kelly because they knew him, they trusted him. He was in the same country club, the same church.
So the medical doctors were sending their patients to a dentist?
That's right. And they were sending to a dentist. Well, legally, he didn't have the right to treat cancer. Dentists can't. But they would send them and they would get well. That was the good news and the bad news. The good news is that word of mouth network started to spread. You know, someone's cousin in Houston heard about my cousin got well, and they would come to Kelly, and then it was the person in New Mexico. Pretty soon people would come from all over the country to Kelly, to his dentist office outside of Dallas and getting well. Well, guess what? The medical board wasn't too happy about it because sooner or later they heard about it. Kelly once told me at one time 14 government agencies were investigating him. And I said, I'm an investigative reporter that I am. I said, you know, people tend to exaggerate. And I looked through the data. Indeed, 14 government agencies, from the local county attorney to the state medical board to the dental board, because the dental board actually took away his license for practicing medicine without a license. He didn't care because he just said he's doing nutrition, kept seeing patients anyway. The state attorneys, the state attorney general, federal attorneys, the IRS, they all colluded, like going after Tea Party groups together. They all colluded to try and get Kelly. You think, here's a guy giving cancer patients nutrition. This isn't like he committed the Holocaust. He's just giving patients with nothing else to do. You can't treat them successfully with any conventional therapy. He's giving them nutrition. And lo and behold, the problem was a lot of them were getting well, which started to upset the medical authorities. And it's interesting, too, and these are stories that, as far as I know, have never been told before. At one point, he was arrested at gunpoint, kind of like a typical 14, the equivalent of a SWAT team in those days. Arrested him, and they always do those things to try and embarrass you. So they came at midnight in front of his kids in pajamas, dragging him away. Well, there was a very prominent Washington politician, high up in the Justice Department, I mean really high up in the Justice Department, who the next day called the local sheriff and said, you let Kelly out, or I'm going to have the entire federal government investigate every one of you. You'll be audited on your income tax for the last 25 years. And he said, you don't want to mess with me. He was let out of jail within 5 minutes of that phone call. And they never went after him again. He continued to practice. He just had patients sign a form saying, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm doing nutritional, and I left him alone. So all these incredible stories, and I would interview patients who would confirm all this. Who, you know, his family. I knew 3 of his 4 kids, And they didn't have an easy time because they were the kids of this crazy cancer quack doctor. And, you know, the Dallas morning newspapers would carry it in the local radio show. Again, this is pre-internet. And it was tough. They would go to school and be, you know, laughed at. You have the crazy quack doctor. So it was tough for them.
Well, I had no idea why the Iranian crisis really started. What an interesting nugget of information from Dr. Gonzalez. Let's listen up as he continues to explain why pancreatic enzymes are so effective at treating cancer. What is it about it, Dr. Gonzalez, in the pancreatic enzymes that is so successful at reversing the cancer?
No one's ever had the financing to do the work. Now, Beer did animal studies 100 years ago. We've done animal studies too. We were fortunate that we've had funding from two major international corporations. People laugh when I say it, but Procter & Gamble gave us millions of dollars to help perfect the enzymes. And Nestle's. The chief of research at Nestle, Pierre Guessery, was the former medical director of the Pasteur Institute. Nestle lured him away to run the research division. Nestle's, in those days, had a $600 million scientific basic science research division. They have a campus in Switzerland off of Lake Geneva that rivals the NIH. It's unbelievable. I've lectured there several times. And Guessery was a real scientist. He's a physician by training and was head of the Pasteur Institute, one of the preeminent research institutions in the world. And he had heard about my work back in 1992. It's like, this is pre-internet. I don't know how people heard about me. Actually, I do know, so I'm actually kind of exaggerating. Pierre he's still alive, lives in Malta now, retired, and has a sailboat and sails around the Mediterranean. He set up a research group to travel the world looking for alternative therapies that might be useful. This is genius people. They don't tend to have prejudices. They just want to see it works. They don't care if it's moon dust or spooky stuff or, you know, radioactive waves. They don't care as long as it works. So they actually set up a division very quietly, highly funded, and they sent a team around the world from jungles in New Guinea to New York to me.
A division within Nestle?
Within Nestle, to look into alternative therapies. Unknown, never was publicized. And they traveled the world, and one day I got a phone call. I'm going off on a tangent about enzymes, but you can all edit this down.
No, this is great stuff.
I got a call from the research director at Nestle. I said, what the heck does the research director at Nestle want to do with me? And I didn't, you know, and then they told me his name, Pierre Guessery. I said, that rings a bell. So this is before internet, so you couldn't Google, but, you know, I found a way. I said, oh, this is the guy who ran the Pasteur Institute. So I called him back. He said, I want to come to New York and meet with you. I said, you want to meet with me? Why? He said, I don't eat chocolate. He said, no, he laughed. Nothing to do with chocolate. He explained that they had been looking into alternative therapies, and my name kept coming up. And he wanted to meet with. So we met with me, and the end result is Nestle agreed to fund studies. They funded our first clinical study that was very successful with pancreatic cancer in humans, but also animal studies back in 2002, 2004 that were done at the University of Nebraska by Parvez Pour, P-O-U-R, who's one of the preeminent researchers in the molecular biology of pancreatic cancer. And Dr. Pour developed an animal model for pancreatic cancer that they used in our study. And he used the most aggressive animal model at his disposal, and Nestle funded him to do this. They were going to really put my enzymes to the test. And it was extremely successful, and Pour told me that this is the first time in his lifetime that he saw this particular model respond to anything. Didn't respond to chemo, anything. So he was very impressed. Published it in a peer-reviewed journal, Pancreas, I think it was in 2004. We have copies around. So we know from animal models they work, from my first clinical study, and we know that it works, but we don't know the molecular biology to answer your question. We don't know how it actually kills cancer cells. What we think is the proteolytic, which are the protein-digesting pancreatic enzymes like trypsin and chymotrypsin, actually tear apart the cell membranes. You know, cell membranes are lipid fatty, but they also have protein molecules that are receptors and pores that allow nutrients to get in and waste products to get out. That's how cells survive, with these protein pores in the membrane. And these are proteins like any other protein. We think the enzymes chew them up. Now, they don't affect normal tissue. And Beard said in his book, 100 in 2011, more than 100 years ago, that there's a reason that cancer cells have the opposite electrical charge than normal cells. Everyone laughed at him at that time. We now know that's true. And normal cells repulse the pancreatic enzymes in the bloodstream, but cancer cells attract them. The enzymes go right to the cancer cell. We believe chew up the proteins on the cell membrane. The cell does. So we think it's that simple. We haven't had the trillions of dollars of funding to substantiate that. And I mean, Pour wanted to do that, but Nestle was willing to fund more. But the key with Nestle is I would have had to turn over my intellectual property. It would have been a co-ownership. They had their patent lawyers in the U.S. filing patents, but it would have been Nestle and me as co-owners. The problem with that is Pierre retires, and the next person may think that's all quackery, and then Nestle owns my work, and I can't do anything with it. So I said, no, thank you, gracious, we're still friends, Pierre and I. And he understood why.
Mr. Griffin, tell us a little bit about the role that pancreatic enzymes might play in prevention and or treatment of cancer.
Yeah, very important. Thanks for asking that. A moment ago I said there were two factors, the extrinsic factor and the intrinsic factor. And we've been talking about the extrinsic factor so far, the food that comes in from outside. But there are certain things that are generated within the body that are very, very important. And one of those happens to be the pancreatic enzymes. We've got trypsin and chymotrypsin and other digestive enzymes that have a special mission of digesting meat protein. Well, why is that important? It's a fascinating story. They have known for a long time that let me back up a little bit by saying, one of the questions that puzzled scientists for a long time is, why doesn't the immune system attack cancer cells? If you're working on the assumption that cancer is something that's foreign to the body, which is not our assumption, of course. Our assumption is that cancer is natural to the body, that's gone awry. But the orthodox view, if cancer is something foreign to the body, it's not supposed to be there, why doesn't the immune system attack it and destroy it? And the answer is that cancer cells have a protein coating around them. A protein coating. And that has a negative electrostatic charge. Okay. It's amazing, the more I learn about how much electricity plays a role inside the body. I used to think it was all chemistry. Well, chemistry is basically electricity. And the little valences, you see the pluses and minuses on the charts and so forth. It's all electricity, or the chemistry doesn't work. But anyway, this protein coating around the cancer cells, one of its unique qualities, has a negative electrostatic charge. Well, the immune cells, the lymphocytes, the leukocytes, the monocytes, all these white blood cells that are supposed to attack the foreign invaders, they have a negative electrostatic charge also. Well, everyone knows that common polarities repel each other, so the cancer cell is well protected against the white blood cell. And I believe the reason is because the cancer cell is not foreign to the body. It's part of the natural protection. Hey, I'm a friend, not a foe. Even though I'm out of whack, I'm still a friend. So now, if you are eating foods that have a lot of meat protein in them, you're probably going to use most, if not all, of that digestive enzyme produced by your pancreas to digest the meat. That's what it's meant to do.
Yeah, makes sense.
And there's very little left over, if anything, left over to do anything else. But if your diet is low in meat protein, and if your pancreas is normal, functioning okay, you should have plenty of digestive enzyme to take care of the meat and still be plenty in the bloodstream. Now, when these digestive enzymes come to the cancer cell, they say, protein, meat. And they will actually digest away that coating. Now the underlying cancer cell is exposed, and it has a positive electrostatic charge. And now here come the white blood cells, and they do literally attack the cancer cell once it's been stripped of its electrical protection. So all of the physicians that I have ever met that are following this alternative therapy, this concept, one of the things they focus on is making sure that the patient changes the diet to either eliminate meat altogether or make sure it's very, very low. And a lot of people don't understand that. They think, well, what is it, just some kind of a vegetarian nut, Do we have to eat vegetables too to go along with it? Well, yeah, you do. If you want to have the full mechanism working in your favor, you definitely, at least if you have clinical cancer, you definitely want to make sure that whatever your pancreas is producing in the way of these digestive enzymes is completely available to do that job.
And that would explain then why many physicians, part of their protocol to treat cancer, add pancreatic enzymes to the protocol.
That's exactly it.
So trypsin and chemotrypsin, they tear apart the cell membrane. They digest the protein coating around the cancer cell, making it visible to your immune system. Fascinating info. Let's hear from G. Edward Griffin as he explains about a substance that is selectively toxic to cancer cells, but doesn't harm any normal cells.
there is a substance in nature, again, it can't be patented, it's in nature, it's in about 1,400 edible plants, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, except on the plates of modern man, because it has a bitter taste to it. And if you have a choice, you know, if you're not just living in a primitive society and you can choose what foods you want, you normally don't choose bitter.
We like sweet.
We like sweet. And that is the beginning of the problem, or at least the answer to the question, why does modern man have cancer and primitive man does not? There's a part of the answer. Well, anyway, this substance is called amygdalin. It's well known. It's been in the pharmacopoeia for almost 100 years. I think it was first isolated and described in Germany. And it's been used for medicinal purposes for a long, long time. Amygdalin is a substance that is bitter, and it's found in grasses and in seeds primarily. And they have found that in those cultures, those places in the world where the diet, the native diet, is rich in amygdalin foods, the cancer rate is very low, if not zero. And you compare the diet to the same food, or you compare that diet to the diet of the people in modern societies where cancer rates are high, and you find there's practically no amygdalin at all. It's just a complete, it's an eye-opener. And, well, what are those cultures? Well, the Hunzas, I think you mentioned a moment ago, are probably the best known. Little kingdom up in northwest Pakistan. And it's a very idyllic place, I'm told. The story Shangri-La, they say, was actually written based upon Hunza as the model. Everybody knows the story of Shangri-La. Well, Hunza is pretty much like that. It's very remote. You risk your life getting into it. And I always thought I wanted to go visit Hunza after I read about it, until I saw some photographs of these deep ravines that you have to walk across on a rope bridge, you know, and it's about 1.5 miles straight down. You go along the cliffs like this, you know. So, no, I think I'll just read about it.
Okay.
But anyway, that is really the way it was. I guess they have a road in now. The people in Hunza never had cancer, but afterwards, when they come out of Hunza and they go into other countries and they start eating the same foods that those people eat, they come down with cancer like everyone else. In Hunza, at least in the beginning when all this research was done, there was no such thing as money. It's a kind of a primitive society. And a man's wealth was measured by the number of apricot trees he owns. And people eat apricot seeds there, a little sweeter than the ones in California, but still loaded with amygdalin. And they eat them like candy. It was like a delicacy there. So there's just one example. There are other cultures, the Vilcabambas, the Navajo and the Hopi Indians, the Aboriginal Eskimos. All of those cultures have zero or very low cancer rates. And if you look at the native diet, in every case, their foods are at least 200 times, if not more, rich in amygdalin than anything that you would find in a major city or even in the countryside in our Western world. So that's a clue. So then the next question is, well, what is this thing amygdalin? How does it work? It's very simple. Amygdalin is a molecule that has 4 components in it, locked together. There are 2 components of sugar, or glucose. There's 1 component of cyanide, and there's the word that scares people. We'll come back to that in a minute. And 1 component of benzaldehyde. Now, people say, wow, cyanide, you want to take cyanide to treat cancer?
Right.
And the answer is, yes, of course. Well, doesn't cyanide kill you? Well, yes, if it's real pure gaseous cyanide. If it's pure cyanide, yes. But when it's in a molecule with other components, it's not cyanide. It's something else. It's like vitamin B12. It's called cyanocobalamin. We would be dead if we didn't have cyanide in our bodies in that form. in cyanocobalamin, it's not cyanide, it's cyanocobalamin. It's a molecule that's made up of one of the components being cyanide. Well, there's a big difference between free cyanide, which is gaseous, or when it's locked with other components or elements.
Sure.
And so that's the key to understanding why we're not worried about cyanide being part of the molecule. The real question is, well, what is it that would release the cyanide? And by the way, the benzaldehyde is toxic too. Most people don't know that. And the two together are even more toxic than 2 times each. So it's, if you release the cyanide and the benzaldehyde, you've released a very toxic component. So you have to be very careful about that. And then the next question is, well, what releases it? And I'm glad you're sitting down for this course. I think you already know this, but I hope everybody watching this is sitting down, because the thing that releases the cyanide and the benzaldehyde is an enzyme called beta-glucosidase. Beta-glucosidase. It's an enzyme. And where is that found? In cancer cells. And only in cancer cells.
Wow.
It's a beautiful mechanism of nature that could not have been accidental. It's the body's natural method of controlling overgrowth, overhealing, because once you get one cell that is an overhealing cell, it contains this unlocking enzyme, as we call it. And the unlocking enzyme comes in contact with amygdalin if you are eating food with amygdalin in it.
That's the big if.
That's the big if, yeah.
It.
If you're not eating food with amygdalin in it, then it doesn't work. But if you are eating, it doesn't take much, just a little bit. And if you are eating it and it's in your bloodstream, it comes in contact with that overgrowth cell. The overgrowth cell releases the toxic components and commits hara-kiri. And you don't even know that anything happened. You come to the conclusion that everybody has cancer all the time, but it's continually being controlled and eliminated by a natural mechanism of the body. It's nothing to worry about. It's part of nature. It's part of the healing process. Only time you need to worry about it is if you've messed up your body in some way, then you've not given it the fuel. You haven't given it the components it needs to do its job. And so that's the big difference between the alternative view of cancer and the orthodox view of cancer.
Talk about the California report of 1953. I've read some of your writings about the California report, and it's a very interesting topic.
It is, and it's a clear example of the degree to which, I guess there's no other word, but fraud. The degree to which fraud, deliberate, conscious fraud, can be injected into what we would normally think is a scientific process. Early in the days of the development of Laetrile, there were stories circulating that people were getting well, they're being treated and they're coming back from the edge of the grave and so forth. And so naturally, the pharmaceutical industry wanted to put an end to this, and so they set up a deal where they wanted to have it tested. The idea is, okay, none of this discussion about people getting saved, none of these little stories, let's just do a scientific test. Well, everybody was in favor of that, except they insisted that only those who were opponents of Laetrile do the tests. And nobody else could do the tests, you see. And it had to be the oncologists and the people on the staff of the pharmaceutical industry and so forth. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, and it is a long story, the California branch of the AMA, the California Medical Association, was given the task of doing a test on Laetrile. And the people who were in charge of this were all in the cancer industry. The two men, as I remember the names correctly, that wrote the analysis of the report were Doctors McFarland and Garland, I think. And McFarland, I think, was a surgeon, and Garland, I think, was a radiologist, or maybe it was the other way around, but they were, it was a surgeon and a radiologist, and the other members of the panel were all in similar positions. Most of them were radiologists, interestingly enough, I think. So anyway, they all had kind of a vested interest in not finding something that would interfere with their businesses, you see. So there was sort of a bias built in. Anyway, they did this very fine scientific study using mice and so forth. They spent a lot of money. And they produced the report, and McFarland and Garland announced that there was no evidence whatsoever that Laetrile had any effect whatsoever in the control of cancer. So that was all anybody needed to hear. There was something done by the California Medical Association and two fine, upstanding doctors. Well, these doctors, is just to give you an idea of how fine and scientifically astute they were. These are the guys that both of them said that there was no connection at all between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And
same doctors?
Same doctors, yeah, before they got involved in this report. They had already been bought and paid for by the tobacco industry, of course. In fact, I think it was McFarland that even made this fantastic quote, "A pack a day keeps cancer away."
I've seen the newspaper ads that they used to run that had that exact quote. That was from him.
That was from him. He was one of the guys. Incidentally, he died in bed some years later in a fire started by his cigarette in bed.
Wow.
Burned him up. I mean, I'm sorry to see anybody die, especially from fire, but I thought it was a certain irony to
poetic justice.
Poetic justice or something.
Huh.
And the other guy died of cancer of the lung. They're both heavy smokers. You know. So anyway, that gives you a little idea of the scientific expertise of these guys. Well, as far as most doctors are concerned, if they see a report from the California Medical Association and it's accepted by, the teaching institutions, there's no question that that is that's science, right? That's authentic.
That's gospel truth.
That is gospel truth. Well, and that it was accepted as gospel truth for quite a while, and then we got hold of a copy of the full report. I've forgotten how we did it, but we did, and it was a big, thick report. And all anybody ever read was that cover page where McDonald and Farland, McFarland and Garland, I'll get it straight. Sound like a comedy routine, doesn't it?
Who's on first?
Who's on first? Anyway, all anybody ever saw was that little summary that they wrote. And it turns out that these guys never used Laetrile themselves. They were just sort of analyzing the laboratory results of the study, and this was their summary. Well, when you go back and read the actual pages of the report, the summary was a lie. An absolute lie.
Kind of like the Cliff Notes being incorrect.
The Cliff Notes were incorrect, yeah. Nobody ever went back to look at. There was plenty of evidence in the laboratory work that it did retard the growth of cancer, in spite of the fact that there was a high question about the quality of the Laetrile they were using. In fact, it was pretty obvious that they did not have good quality Laetrile. It was also obvious they were using lower dosages than was being used in the clinics, and in spite of those two handicaps, the laboratory results were reporting case after case after case where these mice were recovering from cancer, right in the body of the report. And yet the summary was there was absolutely no evidence that there's, et cetera, et cetera. This was sort of the flagship of what had been repeated many times since then. The Sloan Kettering report did pretty much the same thing. And it goes on and on and on. And once people realize that not only is there just ineptitude or bias in the cancer industry, bias against natural therapies, but also deliberate fraud.
Now we're dealing with a different animal. Because when you consider the number of people who die from cancer, this amounts to genocide.
Wow. Unbelievable information from G. Edward Griffin about the suppression of Laetrile back in the 1950s and how this information could have saved people's lives. He equates this to genocide. Sounds like something that would have happened in Soviet Russia, but not in the good old USA.
So I would call the Sovietization of the United States. It's up to Central Soviet to approve the doctor to treat patient, okay? And up to local Soviet, which is usually review to do the rest. So they borrowed the idea from Comrade Stalin, how to really restrict freedom of the people, okay? And that's what they do without any punishment. Some brave doctors are writing about it, but this is one committee after another committee. And you can't go against committee because committee will say, well, this is the committee which really decided what you should do, okay? So like in the communist country, there's a committee who was telling engineers, well, if you don't like the design of your bridge, do it different way because it does not conform to Marxist-Leninist principle. Okay?
Even though they might not have known anything about a bridge.
Yeah.
They would be determining.
Doesn't conform to Marxist-Leninist principle. That's period. That's what it is. And that's the deals with Texas Medical Board.
Wow.
It does not conform to our policy, okay? So forget it. Patients may die, and you should not use it, okay? Yeah.
And I'm sure patients have died.
Oh, many of them have died.
Because of the
okay?
inability
many of
to
them,
access
they
the
died,
treatment.
many of them, they deteriorated because it took months to really approve syncopation. So this country obviously has the finest regulations in the world. In the other countries, it takes simply a telephone call of the doctor to a central agency and notifying them, okay, look, I have such and such patient, I would like to treat them with angioplasties. Can I do it? Sure, you can do it, okay. That's it. So that's what is done, say, in Japan, in Australia, in some other countries, and in European Union countries. They don't need even to ask the government if this is a patient who does not have any other ways to be helped. They can use it, okay? In the United States, you need to file tons of papers, go through various committees, ask the guys in Washington for permission. And recently we got some cases when permission came, but the next day the child died because it was too late, because brain tumors, they don't wait, okay?
They don't wait for the clerks.
No, they may, some of these tumors, they may multiply 5 times in 1 month, okay? So they're extremely deadly, which obviously is part of medical science, which is away from the knowledge of the clerks in Washington. You see, the times are changing very rapidly. This is just 2 weeks ago, there was a second war with FDA, which was finished, okay? They were trying to get rid of us for a couple of years. Initially, it started with smear campaign, which is typical for Soviet Russia. They typically use KGB to start with some little reporter with unknown newspaper to begin smear campaign, and then it spreads to the largest newspaper in the country, and that's what happened, okay?
That's what they're doing here now.
Yeah, well, it spread to USA Today, whatever, okay? They hired a bunch of bloggers to continuously smear us everywhere. It's nothing unusual. It was practiced by communists, practiced by Nazis. That's normally what is done by big totalitarian agencies.
Coming from a man who left communist Poland to immigrate to the United States, those statements from Dr. Brzezinski are quite telling. Let's hear a little bit about the history of one of the most well-known clinics in Mexico, the Oasis of Hope, by the founder's son, Dr. Francisco Contreras.
In the 60s, my father was the director of one of the biggest oncology centers in Mexico City. He was an army doctor, and he went on a tour on vacation and visited one of the hospitals of the time of Hippocrates, around 300 years before Christ. And they gave him a tour, and the tour guide told him, you know, this hospital at that time was divided into 3 areas, and the patients would come to the first area and be evaluated physically. The second area, they would be evaluated emotionally. On the third area, it was more or less a spiritual thing. There was a tunnel, and they would go through the tunnel, and somebody outside would be telling the guy that was going through the tunnel, unbeknownst to them, you'll be healed, you'll be healed. And they thought that it was the gods. And after that experience, my father said, well, you know, the reason why we're failing in oncology so much is that we become mechanics of the human body, and we're not paying attention to the emotional and spiritual needs of our patients. So I'm going to go back and change that. Went back, told the staff what they were going to do. Next day, they kicked them out.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
And that was the genesis of the Oasis of Hope. My father said, well, if the system doesn't want to do it, I'm going to do it. And so he began his work caring for the patients, not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He began singing with them, giving them Bible studies, laughter therapy. And about 3 or 4 years later, a lady from San Diego that went to Canada to do a study with lateral, a clinical trial with lateral, came back to San Diego, and my father at that time was the only pathologist in Mexico and in San Diego. So all of the oncologists in San Diego knew him, and when she came back and she wanted to continue with lateral, nobody wanted to give it to her. So one oncologist says, well, I know an oncologist in Mexico, they're less stringent there, why don't you go and see him? Came to my dad, and told her her problem. My father said, well, I don't know anything about this, but she was just riddled with cancer. So she said, I see no problem. I'll give it to you. So she started giving her. 6 months later, she's still alive. A year later, no tumor activity. And so my father said, well, there's something to this. And this lady knew everybody that was going to Canada for the trial, brought everybody to my dad. And just a few years later, the Oasis of Hope, that was a holistic approach to cancer, now also had alternative therapies. And so our aim has always been to integrate whatever therapies are available to us from the conventional and from the alternative that we can use to improve the quality of life of our patients. And we have been very successful. You can check our statistics on our website, oasisofhope.com. And our 5-year survival rates in the most common tumors are between 2 and 5 times better than the national average in the United States of America. Lateral has been our golden therapy for the last 50 years. It's a very innocuous anti-tumor agent that works for most common cancers. Then for patients that do not respond well to lateral, we have a high-dose vitamin C in a very special way, given in a very special way that actually converts the vitamin C virtually into chemotherapy without any of the side effects. We have hyperthermia available. We have all kinds of vaccines. Another major part of the therapy is signaling transduction with foods to block the production of enzymes and proteins that are absolutely necessary for the tumors to grow. And that is what, the combination of all of this is what we call the Contreras metabolic therapy or integrative therapy. We also use a number of immune stimulation agents, not only the laughter therapy and the emotional uplifting music, all of the things that we mentioned before, but we have a product from Japan that has proven to be very effective, and there's at least 70 publications, AHCC, and has proven to improve significantly the quality and quantity of the immune system. So our therapeutic approach really has about 25 different things that will integrate depending on the patient's needs and on the patient's status.
I honestly don't know another medical doctor that uses this many different approaches all under one roof.
Right. There's probably no other clinic in North America that houses the staff and the equipment and the array of treatments that we have, because we're not just interested in what's available in the United States. We reach outside of the United States and the world to find all the treatments. Like GC-MAF is not even made in the United States, so we get our GC-MAF from another country. And so,
what do you mean? What does that stand for?
GC-MAF is a macrophage activating factor. Macrophages are the pac-man of your immune system.
Okay.
And so when you have an illness, and I'm not just talking about cancer, but many chronic illnesses, we make an enzyme called nagalase, and nagalase poisons the macrophages, prohibiting them doing their job. And so that macrophage activating factor is a substance that you can give internally, either injection form, inhalation form, oral form, from everything from autism to cancer.
And so that would, the macrophages are, you call them the Pac-Man, so they eat, what do they eat? They
eat the things that your body doesn't like. So for example, viruses and bacteria and fungi and chemicals and toxins, everything that is attacking the body that is unable to do its job and have a functioning immune system.
I love that quote by Dr. Keneally, that macrophages are the Pac-Men of the immune system. I mean, just picture that in your head. You can see the Pac-Men chomping down the bad guys, almost like a military invasion. Speaking of military, one of my favorite military movies is a World War II movie, Steve McQueen, The Great Escape. Remember when he died in 1980 of mesothelioma? And you remember the story that you heard? We're going to learn the rest of the story from Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez.
The Steve McQueen story has never been properly told. That's another big thing. There are all kinds of biographies about Steve McQueen, and they mentioned Kelly, the crazy guy. I've talked to some of these authors. They never really investigated it properly. I know the whole story. In fact, in this office, about 25 feet from where we're sitting, I have Steve McQueen's complete medical records. even when he used assumed names. I've got all his records here. I got them from Kelly. So they're in this office. I know the whole story. I know it like nobody else has because no one else has ever had his complete medical file. McQueen was kind of a reckless guy, motorcycle racer, smoker, drinker, lived a hard life as he's famous for. He started getting sick 1978, 1979. He went to his fancy Los Angeles doctors, and they kind of blew it off. You know, he lived too hard. He got to cut down the smoking. No one took him seriously. Finally, he was so debilitated, he went to his doctors. He says, you got to do something. Finally, the genius gets the idea. Let's do a chest x-ray. He's got tumors in both lungs. They work him up. He's got metastatic mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is associated with asbestos exposure. Well, he was a motorcycle fanatic. And in those days, the pipes in motorcycles were lined with asbestos. And he would work on his own, he was a great mechanic and work on his own motorcycles. So he was exposed to a huge amount of asbestos and ended up with a mesothelioma. In those days, you know, 35 years ago and today, mesothelioma is completely incurable once it spreads. The only hope is to get it early and do surgery. Well, his brilliant doctors had completely missed the diagnosis for a year, so by the time it was diagnosed, it was metastatic. Then the geniuses decided to give him immunotherapy. I'm trained as a classical immunologist under Robert Good. There's never been a study in the history of the world showing immunotherapy has any effect on mesothelioma. Talk about quackery. And they'd give it to him. Didn't work, so then they decided to give him radiation, or maybe they gave him the radiation first. I'd have to pull up my notes. There's never been a study in the history of the world showing radiation works with mesothelioma. Guess what? It didn't work. So he ends up with stage 4 advancing cancer, weeks from death, goes to see Kelly. Kelly made one fatal mistake in the treatment of Steve McQueen. He took him on as a patient. He was too advanced, and he was a reckless guy. He was still smoking, still drinking. But he pleaded, and Kelly was a very compassionate guy. He said, I'll treat you, but you're too weak. You can't do this at home the way most of my patients do. There was a hospital in Mexico at the time that was administering parts of Kelly's therapy. He says, go down to that hospital in Mexico, and I'll kind of direct them. And he did, and wasn't 100% compliant. He still had the Haagen-Dazs ice cream kind of smuggled in from his friends and cigarettes. But he did enough of it, so he started getting better. And then one of the doctors in Mexico gets the brilliant idea, let's open him up because they think the tumor in he had a tumor in his abdomen as well as in his chest. Let's take it out, I think it's a dead tumor. They do the surgery, the next day he dies of a pulmonary embolus, which is a blood clot in the lungs. He did not die of mesothelioma. In fact, the tumor was a dead tumor. Kelly used to have it in his office in formaldehyde, a dead tumor that had shrunk down from a huge tumor down to nothing. It was dead. He didn't die from, you know, the way the media reports read, which I have, is like Kelly took a gun and shot McQueen, you know, this crazy quack doctor. The true story has never been told. First, his brilliant conventional doctors missed the diagnosis for a year. Then they give him immunotherapy, which is worthless. Then they give him radiation, which is worthless. When all that fails, then he goes to see Kelly, who keeps him alive, kills the tumor, and then gets blamed for killing Steve McQueen. So it's a bizarre story. In none of the media reports did they mention the fact that the diagnosis had been missed and the conventional doctors had done everything they could do. And even today, 2014, metastatic mesothelioma is universally 100% incurable by standard therapies. Now, we have patients who've done beautifully with us. So Kelly got blamed for that. He was absolutely devastated by that. It really threw him off, and he never really recovered.
Wow, what an amazing story that Dr. Gonzalez just shared with us about Steve McQueen. If you remember, I'm a big Steve McQueen fan. One of the best war movies I think ever was The Great Escape. And Steve McQueen, one of my heroes, he died of mesothelioma, as Dr. Gonzalez just shared. The interesting thing was, as you just heard, that Dr. Kelly actually didn't kill him. He was known as the quack that killed Steve McQueen, but in reality, the tumors were necrotic. Dr. Kelly was actually curing Steve McQueen of his mesothelioma, which is an incurable form of cancer, by the way, according to traditional oncologists. And actually the surgery killed him. It's interesting the way that these things are spun so that the general public now believes that Dr. Kelly, who is now deceased, murdered Steve McQueen, when in reality he was healing him. Wow, what a powerful story. Now I want to make it clear here, folks, we're not telling you not to go with traditional treatments. We are not trying to make a decision for you. Our goal is to educate. And the fact of the matter is there are many options to treat cancer. And so we want you to know that information so that you can make an informed decision if that diagnosis ever comes. That's our goal. It's not to persuade you one way or the other. And while we're talking about other options, there are more options that you still haven't learned about. We have not shared with you, and we're going to share with you in tomorrow night's show. So I know you learned tonight about a lot of natural treatments for cancer, and tomorrow night you're going to learn about even more of them. I know you're going to want to join us again tomorrow night. I look forward to seeing you then. Help support our mission, join the movement, and save lives. When you choose to own the 11-part docuseries, The Quest for the Cures Continues today, you'll help us to achieve our goal to eradicate cancer once and for all. And a portion of the proceeds from each and every sale goes to one of 3 cancer charities that are actually researching real, effective, non-toxic treatments for cancer. Plus, you'll receive a second digital set absolutely free that you can share with your friends and your family. Be a hero and choose to support our mission today. You'll be glad you did.
My name is Dana. I am 35 years old, and I began a journey with cancer 7 years ago when I was 28. I found out about this cancer on Christmas Eve in 2006, and I had emergency surgery on Christmas morning to remove stage 3 colon cancer that had not only attached to my colon, but had ruptured into my small intestines. We began a chemo regimen of 6 months chemo treatment through a portacat, where I would have IV treatments and I would have to go home with a little IV bag, so I was attached to chemo for 3 days at a time. This went on for 6 months, and at the end of the 6 months, it was wonderful to have a scan and hear the news that I was cancer-free. There's nothing like hearing that you're cancer-free after a long cancer battle. But of course, once you began a cancer battle, you have to continue having further testing to make sure that you remain healthy. So 6 months after my testing, and I was told I was cancer-free, I had another scan. This time the scan came back that the cancer had returned, and it had returned in the lymph nodes between my neck and my lower abdomen, and it was spread throughout my body. Because the cancer had returned and it was spread, I was told I was stage 4. So after 2 rounds with colon cancer, I was told that I was once again cancer-free, and we celebrated and thought this time we've really beat it. This time it's done. Later in that same year, I had another PET scan just to confirm that the cancer was gone. PET scan came back clean. There was no signs of cancer. Within just 3 weeks, I myself noticed on my neck that I had some enlarged lumps on my neck that I found very strange. So I told my doctor about it, and they said, let's do another PET scan just to see what we have going on here. This time, the PET scan came back very different than the first one. This time it came back showing that I had between 10 to 15 tumors all throughout my abdomen and my neck, that the cancer was back full force, stronger than ever, and this time I was told that I was terminal. I decided that all the approaches we had taken before obviously weren't working. Something had to change. I felt like we had been going about my treatment the entirely wrong way. So as my family and I were doing research, we came across many ads for cancer cures. We came across much information that worked for some people. The same thing didn't work for other people. We really didn't know which way to turn. We didn't know what to take. We didn't know what to believe. One thing we did all do is read the book Cancer Free by Bill Henderson, which describes the battle that he went through with his wife during her cancer treatments. And it also is a very informal book of how to find supplements, how to find other ways of treating your cancer, even in conjunction with treatment, with chemotherapy. But before I started chemo, I decided to focus on one supplement in the book and order it to begin that supplement before I even began chemo treatments. That supplement was called Beta-1 3D-Glucan. I didn't have any idea if this supplement was helping me at all in the beginning. There wasn't necessarily a way to measure it. What I did know is since I had put off my chemo treatments at the time, I was still having blood tests done, and the blood tests, the CEA blood test count numbers, were showing that it was dropping, even without chemo treatments. This was unexplained by my oncologist. Once I stopped the IV chemo treatments and I continued taking beta-glucan, the numbers still continued to drop, even though I was not on the chemo that should remove cancer. So we decided to do a PET scan after just 6 weeks of the IV chemo, since I could no longer tolerate it. The scan came back showing no signs of cancer. This was remarkable. It was truly amazing. We had no idea how 6 oncologists could tell me, you will never be cancer-free again. You will not survive this. To this day, they cannot explain what happened to my cancer, where it went, or why it is still gone. they have no idea why I am cancer-free at this point. The one consistent item during all this time, during the last 4.5 years of being cancer-free, is my diet, which has been changed to a very healthy diet. It's related to, I believe, my supplements that I've been taking, and I strongly believe it's related to taking the beta-1 3D-glucan. Whenever newly diagnosed cancer patients talk to me about their health, what they can do to change their health, even in combination with their chemo or radiation treatments, even in combination with their surgeries, I tell them the #1 item that I suggest is the beta-1 3D-glucan. I found it locally. It can be ordered out of the Marietta, Georgia office. It can also be ordered online at betterwayhealth.com. I prefer to buy local, and it worked out great for me in my case. I tell them exactly where to get it. I tell them that it's worth it. If you have a budget, if you have only so many things you can do, this is one thing that I believe will work for you. It certainly helped me. The science couldn't explain why my cancer was gone, but we can take our health into our own hands.